Inflating is probably one of, if not the most important technique to learn when starting out. That's why the first day spent practicing it at glide school usually stands out in a paraglider's memory. It's the first contact you'll have with the equipment and is usually accompanied by your first uncertainties. It's also the occasion for instructors to give invaluable advice. At this stage, you'll learn how to correctly handle your equipment, observe your environment for ideal conditions, and concentrate. Above all, you'll learn how to properly inflate the canopy and make a good run, the two prerequisites for a safe launch. Pay attention to what your instructor says. He'll explain all of the basic techniques you'll be expected to develop throughout your training. Launching is the most hazardous moment of paragliding. Most accidents occur during the launch. Make sure you know what you're doing. Practice regularly your ground handling techniques. With enough practice, you'll be making beautiful and safe launches in no time. It's the first step to a successful flight. Preparing the equipment and going through the pre-flight safety inspection must become second nature. Being strict and using a simple but effective methodology will prevent errors and give you all the more chances to make safe and successful launches. Start by laying your wing out on the slope. A wing is always inflated facing the wind. Facing the wind, you'll find it much easier to obtain the relative wind needed to create lift. It will also make shorter launch distances possible, which can be useful for certain sites. When launching, several different scenarios are possible. A headwind, the ideal situation. Using this configuration, orient your wing so that it's facing downhill and into the wind. A crosswind. The wind is no longer blowing along the launch axis. Launching is still possible, but it will require more skill. Orient your wing so that it's facing the wind and inflate it. Once the wing is inflated and stabilized over your head, adapt your launch run so that it brings you back into the launch axis. Launching with a tailwind is impossible. In a scenario where there isn't any wind, orient your wing so that it's lined up with the steepest slope. Don't hesitate to reposition your wing along its entire wingspan so that when you're ready to inflate it, its layout is ideal. Some pilots recommend laying it out in a slight V-shape or in the shape of a horseshoe so that both halves of the wing inflate evenly. Considering the new orientation, reposition the harness in the center of the wing. Notice how Christopher has positioned himself. The lines are almost tensioned, which will make it easier for him to untangle them. Take hold of the risers at the carabiner and make sure they are untwisted. Hold the A-risers in front of you. Isolate the A-lines, then work your way towards the wing and verify that they are free of twists, tangles, knots and debris all the way to the leading edge. We can clearly see here that they are located underneath the other lines. You'll have to untwist the harness. Start out by correctly repositioning the lines, then continue to untwist them up to their base. This method makes it easy to figure out which way to spin the harness in order to eliminate the twist. New verification. Make sure the lines are free all the way to the leading edge. The harness is now on the ground without any twists. It's time to untangle the lines. As we saw earlier, Christopher isolates the A-lines and puts some tension on them as he works his way towards the wing. Often, you can verify that the lines are not tangled or knotted by simply putting tension on the lines. Do the same thing for each set of lines. Untangling the lines can be done rather quickly and easily if you put the right amount of tension on them. Christopher is now ready to put on his equipment and the harness. The pre-flight inspection begins. Remember to check your reserve parachute rubber bands as well as its handles to avoid pulling it by accident during the launch or the flight. You can put on and attach the harness. Inspect and fasten the leg straps at the same time. You should be able to slide your hand between your leg and the strap. Fasten the abdominal strap next, followed by the chest strap. The pre-flight continues. Christopher inspects his carabiners, then each quick link, and finally the connection of his brake handle. Now you're ready to grab your glider's controls. Let the risers hang down untwisted alongside your legs, unhook the brake handle, then go under the network of risers so you come up grasping the A-risers. Then double-check that the A-risers are completely free up to the leading edge. In addition, make sure the brake line isn't blocked. Do the same thing for the other half of the wing. You're ready to launch. There are two different ways to inflate the wing, either facing the wing called reverse launch or with your back to it called forward launch. It's a good idea to master both techniques because each one has its advantages in different conditions. In general, use forward launch in light winds and reverse launch in wind over 10 km per hour. That way you'll be able to choose the most suitable technique according to the weather and the terrain. Let's first look at a forward launch with your back to the canopy. Pilots usually use it when there is little or no wind, since it provides continuity throughout the thrust, inflation, and launch run, and thus prevents the wing from collapsing. Jerome Cano, a test pilot with Ozone paragliders, is going to take us through the steps and techniques of a flawless inflation. The wing is correctly laid out facing the wind. Then the pilot positions himself in its center. He's ready to give the thrust. You need to provide enough thrust so that the wing rises evenly until it's just over your head. Be careful. The thrust you'll give depends on the wind speed. If the wind is strong, especially when performing a reverse inflation, give very little thrust, otherwise you'll be yanked off the ground. The wing climbs until it is directly over your head. To prevent it from overrunning you, use the brakes to control it. Without this control, the wing will overrun you, lose its lift and collapse. At this point, you can visually inspect your wing to make sure it has the right shape and that there aren't any knots in the lines. Now's the time to decide whether to continue or abort the launch. You're ready to start your launch run. Notice Jerome's position. He is leaning forward with his shoulders sticking out beyond the risers. To abort your launch, pull the brakes all the way under your backside and continue to advance until the wing falls behind you. As you can see, a forward inflation is also possible in strong winds. However, a reverse inflation is more suitable for strong winds. It enhances the pilot's ability to control his wing. If he needs to reduce his force, he can walk uphill towards the wing without the risk of falling. Pilots tend to prefer this method since it lets them see the wing during the entire inflation process. Let's take a look at the two main techniques for grasping the risers. Start out by spinning to face the wing in the direction that seems most natural to you. The risers should be crossed in front of you. The first technique, known as cross-brake reverse launch, allows the pilot to inflate the canopy and then launch without letting go of the brake handles. Jerome takes the left brake handle in his left hand, then the right brake handle in his right hand. Then he grasps the risers in front of each hand. Let's go over again from the beginning how he grasps the handles and inflates the canopy. Jerome can launch without ever letting go of the handles. Notice the skill involved in each step: inflation, timing, visual inspection, spinning, filling the wing. The second technique used to hold the controls is referred to as the uncrossed hands technique. Let's go back to the situation where we're facing the wing with the risers crossed in front of you. This time, Jerome takes the left brake handle in his right hand and the right brake handle in his left hand. In other words, the handle located in front of each hand. Then he grasps the risers in front of each hand. Some pilots find it easier to control the wing using this technique. Its one major inconvenience is that the pilot has to momentarily let go of the controls at the important and potentially most dangerous part of the launch, when the pilot makes the turn. The paraglider is a pendulum-like system. In the air, without any stress acting upon it, it will naturally tend towards equilibrium. What this means is that in the air, if the wing recedes behind or advances past the pilot will automatically be brought back under it. Likewise, when the wing swings to the left or to the right, the pilot and his equipment are brought back in line by the pendulum. On the ground, everything is different. If the wing goes one way, the pilot needs to move to get back underneath it. The pilot must act as the pendulum whilst on the ground. During a launch, if your wing rises unevenly, don't panic. It's easy to recover from the situation and make a normal launch. The first thing to do is follow your wing while at the same time trying to correct its course with the opposite brake handle. Once you've managed to get the wing stabilized above your head, you're ready to start your launch run towards the exit corridor. Look at this example with Jerome. His wing is rising unevenly and is abnormally centered in relation to the wind. He'll know from experience to get under the wing while correcting with the brake handles. Having stabilized the wing, he'll be able to spin and start his launch run. As you've just seen, getting the wing to rise evenly depends on how well it is centered in relation to the wind. When launching, use the wind to slightly pre-inflate your wing and check your centering. The two halves of your wing must be at the same height. With experience, turning around will become second nature. However, during our first few inflations, sometimes we're not quite sure which direction to turn. There's an easy way to remember. Look for the riser on top. This is the direction you have to turn. Inflating in strong winds is possible but requires a great deal of skill. A lot of launch accidents occur when strong winds are present. Here's a hint to reduce the force of your wing during the inflation. Only use the central A risers to inflate canopies that are equipped with 4 A risers. This way, only the center of your wing is tensioned while inflating. Its force is reduced. The most important thing is to practice as much as possible inflating on the ground. It'll put you at ease and provide you with all the techniques you'll need during a launch. You now know how to correctly prepare your equipment and make beautiful launches all by yourself. Let's go over some wind-related aspects of conditions that you'll be able to use to modify your flight path. During flight, it is possible that you will come across lift and sink along with headwinds, crosswinds, and tailwinds. All of these will directly influence your trajectory. It is important for your flight plan, and especially for your landing, that you understand all of the ways in which these conditions can affect your trajectory. To make sense of what follows, you need to remember that a paraglider advances and falls at the same speed as the surrounding air. The airspeed and lift-to-drag ratio are technical specifications that do not change unless the canopy is damaged or worn. However, the air that surrounds it can move in all sorts of directions. That's why we also refer to the ground speed and the glide ratio. These values tell us the speed at which the paraglider advances and falls, but this time in relation to the ground. First situation. In a calm and stable air mass, without lift, sink, or wind, the paraglider's trajectory will not be disturbed. It'll approximately fly at the speed specified by the manufacturer. The same applies to the sink rate, which also figures in the technical specifications. In this example, the ground speed and the glide ratio are roughly the same as the airspeed and the lift-to-drag ratio. Second example. The paraglider is flying into a 15 km/h headwind. In this case, the horizontal ground speed is reduced. It can be easily calculated by subtracting the wind speed from the paraglider's airspeed, since they are moving in opposite directions. 37 minus 15 equals 22 kilometers per hour. Though its ground speed has decreased, the paraglider still falls at the same speed. Thus, for the same altitude, it runs a shorter distance. Its glide ratio has decreased. A new example. The headwind is now 35 kilometers per hour, almost the same speed as the paraglider, which, by the way, could end up being rather dangerous and should therefore be avoided. In this case, the ground speed is almost zero. The paraglider continues to descend at the same speed and appears to be falling vertically. Know how to get your bearings and observe these phenomena. Adapt your flight plan accordingly so that you're sure to make it to the landing field. Let's take a look at how flying with a tailwind can affect your trajectory. As you might have guessed, a 15 km per hour tailwind will increase the paraglider's ground speed. 37 plus 15 equals 52 km per hour. Falling at the same speed as before, yet moving faster, the paraglider in this case will cover much more distance. The glide ratio has increased. Here's another example, this time with a 35 km per hour tailwind. The paraglider's speed will be close to, if not more than, 70 km per hour. This is why cross-country flying is usually done on days when wind conditions help the pilot reach his destination, and also why pilots always land into the wind. Wind is what causes an air mass to move. Depending on your orientation, these movements can increase or decrease your glide ratio relative to the ground. They also cause drifts that you need to compensate for in order to maintain your heading. Besides the wind, other factors disturb an air mass and cause it to move vertically. Flying through a thermal lift or a downdraft can also influence your trajectory. As a reference, let's start with the trajectory of a paraglider in a stable air mass. In the absence of lift or sink, the sink rate is approximately 1.2 meters per second. In this case, the trajectory corresponds to the canopy's technical specifications, which means that its glide ratio is the same as its lift-to-drag ratio. Here's a new situation. The paraglider comes across a warm pocket of air called a thermal that is rising at 3 meters per second. As he enters into it, he is carried aloft by the rising air. His altitude will increase and he'll be able to use this additional fuel to cover more distance than if he were in a stable air mass. Whilst the glider is in the thermal, it continues to descend at its sink rate of 1.2 meters per second. But, since the air mass it is flying in is rising faster at 3 meters per second, the paraglider will gain altitude in relation to the ground. The climbing speed will be 3 meters per second minus 1.2 meters per second, which equals 1.8 meters per second. You may have already guessed that in the opposite case, when the paraglider comes across a downdraft, his sink rate will increase because he is falling in a mass of descending air. He'll cover less distance than under stable air mass conditions. Here's another example where the wind influences the trajectory. The paraglider is flying in a crosswind. In this first case, the paraglider wants to fly over point A. However, he neglects to take into account the direction of the wind and ends up drifting off course. He'll have to correct his heading. With his new heading towards point A, he is now facing a headwind. As we've seen earlier, this situation drastically reduces his glide ratio. Depending on his altitude and the wind speed, he may not make it to his destination or even end up in the trees. In the second case, the paraglider takes into account the crosswind. This time he orients his canopy at a slight angle into the wind. This is called crabbing and allows him to stay on his heading and fly over point A. During flight, pay attention to conditions you come across. Adjust your trajectory early enough so that you stay on course and are sure to make it back to the landing field. Be particularly attentive during the approach and landing phases, as they require a great deal of precision. An air mass is influenced by winds and thermal activity. Since a paraglider flies within this dynamic environment, it's understandable that these movements will influence it in turn. Let's start out by defining the three rotational axes of a paraglider: roll, pitch, and yaw. First off, let's look at a model showing the pilot and the paraglider's combined center of gravity. It's located just above the pilot's head. This right-to-left motion, called roll, is induced by the pilot or is caused when part of the wing comes into contact with a thermal. The second movement of the wing is the pitch. It's the wing's forwards-backwards movement. Like the roll, it is affected by air mass movements or controlled by the pilot, though in this case usually as an exercise. In order to adapt your piloting techniques during the flight, two important aspects concerning the pitch need to be understood and recognized. Later on, during your training and under an instructor's supervision, you'll learn how to make use of the following pitch exercise. But first, let's explain pitch movement. The pitch increases when the pilot or a thermal causes the wing to increase the angle of attack. This movement is followed by a recoil which we call the surge. Acting like a pendulum, the wing tries to recover its position over the pilot's head. It will therefore have to accelerate to catch up. The stronger the pitch back, the stronger the surge. The pilot must be ready to brake. Pilots need to understand how this pendulum-like effect is created by the pilot and the wing. At some stage during your training, you'll be expected to practice these pitch exercises in stable air with radio support. The final rotational axis of the wing is the yaw. It includes all movements along the vertical axis running from the pilot through the center of the wing. It can occur on the ground when inflating the wing, or in flight when the wind suddenly changes directions, in the presence of gusts, for example. As you progress through your training, you'll need to learn how to recognize and control these movements, which is called active flying. That way, you'll be able to adapt your piloting, keep the wing over your head, and be in total control of your paraglider. Let's now consider the last stage of any flight, the landing. The landing involves two phases: the approach pattern, or simply called the approach, and the final, which is the last leg of the approach before landing. An approach pattern allows you to better position yourself in relation to the landing target by gradually losing altitude. The approach pattern is part of the flight plan that your instructor sets up before launching. During your first flights, it is never improvised. Before taking flight, you should visit the landing field to get an idea of its layout and specific features. There are three indispensable rules for any approach. First, figure out the direction of the wind on the ground. Use the windsock to orient yourself so that the last leg of your pattern, the final, is facing the wind. Second, stay outside of the field near its edge and keep your eye on the landing target. Third, never turn your back on the field. This will prevent you from losing sight of the landing target. An S-turn landing approach allows the pilot to lose altitude by making a series of S-turns within a cone of safe airspace. The size of the S's decreases as the pilot loses altitude. By tracing smaller and smaller S's, the pilot loses enough altitude and lines himself up with the target for the final approach. When using this technique, turns need to be smooth and steady. Make sure you avoid steep turns near the ground. A series of figure 8 turns are used to lose altitude. The 8s get smaller and smaller so that the pilot can lose altitude and get in line with the landing field before his final turn. If the pilot overshoots the landing, he can trace different sized figure 8s to reposition himself. This type of approach is technically challenging. The pilot needs to know how fast his speed and altitude are changing in relation to the ground. This approach is ideal for a landing on a field surrounded by obstacles. The U, or standard aircraft approach, has 2 phases. This approach is also called constant aspect approach. The first phase. Without taking his eyes off the target, the pilot approaches the landing field along one of its sides. Though unusual, the pilot will be flying downwind during this phase. He needs to take this into account when assessing his airspeed. The second phase, the base leg. By looking at the target, the pilot will determine the best moment to make his first turn. The rest of the approach depends on this turn. The pilot needs to figure out how much distance he has left to cover, as well as the altitude he'll need before making the final turn.